I'd like to acknowledge the nations on whose traditional territory we are gathering: Sinixt, Ktunaxa, Secwepemc, and the Selkirk. I wish to extend a warm welcome to all of you participating in the One River Ethics Matters Conference today. We're delighted to have you here.
For this fourth conference concerning the Columbia River Basin, we continue with our common theme, One River, Ethics Matter.
The idea of ethics for me is one of the reasons that I spent a number of years listening to my elders, traveling with them, listening to them about what it means to us as Selkirk people. And I'm not trying to fit it into and privilege anybody else's idea of ethics. What I want to talk about is the ethics that I understand from my elders in my language, and not to be disrespectful to anybody else's, but to privilege and respect our point of view about ethics and the truth that water is life. That's my grandfather. Tom Louis is my first cousin. He was a child at the time of the ceremony of tears at Kettle Falls, shortly before the Grand Coulee Dam permanently flooded the waterfalls in June 1940. And this is them watching there. There's my grandfather right there in the foreground, and you can see Tom sitting there. My grandfather, great-grandfather, Ktunaxa, Chief Ktunaxa, the Kettle Rivers people, understood the ethic that we have to carry as Indigenous people, that we have to teach to the people that have come here to our lands. The ethic that the salmon and the river is there because that's what the Creator decided to put there. And that it is a gift that is meant to feed not only the human beings, but all of the things that it feeds throughout that river system.
We are painfully aware of the serious human rights violations and injustices visited upon tribes, First Nations, and property owners in both Canada and the United States during the dam building era on the Columbia River. And we are convinced that that truth must continue to be spoken and acknowledged, and that the way forward to address, and as much as possible to repair, the damages to those affected, both the people and the environment. And therefore, we seek, by this One River Ethics Matter initiative, to address the serious injustices of the dam building era on First Nations and tribes, on others who lived and gained their livelihoods along the river, on the salmon and other riverine communities, and on the river itself.
The 2001 International Pastoral Letter continues to provide an initial ethical framework for our discussions today. But I wish to go on to another important ethical document. On May 24th, 2015, Pope Francis issued his encyclical letter, Laudato Si, on care for our common home. This letter repeats the biblical and religious traditions already outlined in the 2001 pastoral letter. However, Pope Francis underlines a number of important principles which give urgency to our present discussions. When we speak of the environment, what we really mean is a relationship between nature and the society that lives within it. Nature cannot be regarded as something separate from ourselves or as a mere setting in which we live. We are part of nature. We are included in nature, and thus we are in constant interaction with nature. Thirdly, to seek only technical remedies to each environmental problem is to separate what is in reality interconnected and to mask the true and deeper problems of the global system. It is essential to show special care for Indigenous communities and their cultural traditions. They are not merely one minority among others, but they should be principal dialogue partners, especially when large projects affecting their land are proposed. For Indigenous peoples, land is not a commodity, but it is a gift from God and from their ancestors who rest there. It is a sacred space with which they need to interact if they are to maintain their identity and their values.
Water itself is such a powerful image running through the Judeo-Christian tradition. It's a sign of life, it's a sign of God's blessing, a sign of cleansing and renewal. And in the Hebrew scriptures, the symbol of living waters that are flowing and clean and life-giving are identified as a sign of God's own gift of life. In the history of the Columbia River, there have been many blessings. Communities and peoples have thrived. People have enjoyed employment. Recreational sites have been developed. Flood control and power generation have enhanced the life of many. But there have also been many injustices. As First Nations were ignored in the original treaty negotiations and then relocated from ancestral lands. As settlers were moved out and homes and farms destroyed. As the river itself was subject to pollution and salmon and other fish habitat destroyed. You will know the stats. 32,000 hectares of fertile agricultural land was lost. 42,000 hectares of forest in the Kootenays was destroyed. A dozen small communities, places of home and livelihood, of worship and community life were displaced, and about 2,000 people lost their homes. The question of justice and right relationships hovers just below the surface of the recent history of the Columbia River.
The memories that we have is my generation. I'm a second generation tribal member who lost salmon with the construction of Cooley Dam. My dad, myself, my kids, and their kids, so there's 4 generations of us now that have lost that culture, that ability to fish at the river, to do all of those things that for thousands of years we did. So
the hunting treaty was a really good example of how our people could work together to manage the resources and protect the environment. It was allowing for hunting in a controlled way so that we can manage the habitat for the elk and for the salmon at that time. We would also like to say we look forward to continuing to work together with all nations to ensure that we have a voice during the Columbia River Treaty renewal process.
I'm an apprentice, the child who hosts the salmon ceremony. He's showing me, he's teaching me, he's giving me that. It's not an elected position. It's a lifelong responsibility to uphold those values. Salmon. What does salmon mean to our people? We are river people. Salmon is fundamental to our social, economic, political, and all of our other governance and living activities. The basic principle is, from what I understand, the SEAL ethic of sustainability. That's 100% regeneration.
But how can we accept the violation of rivers as being ethical? The destruction of them and all their vital purposes, so perfectly created, just to suit 2 conveniences: flood control and power generation. How have we come to believe that is actually for the common good?
As the Grand Chief once said, the Columbia River Treaty represents the largest infringement in most significant impact to the Okanagan Nation. And that's the First Nations, and more broadly the communities in the basin have not had an involvement and a say over how the water systems are managed in this region. And that's going to change. It has to change, it will change. We're at a crossroads of significant momentum both for communities and First Nations to ensure that the interests of future generations are going to be adhered to in how we manage this system, which essentially is now we've created an artificial system. In conjunction with a huge array of partners have worked incredibly hard to try to address salmon, getting salmon back up into the Okanagan system, which of course is a tributary to the Columbia. So for us, we need to establish that we've got processes for Indigenous communities to meaningfully address the impacts, and those are historic impacts and those are ongoing impacts. We need more transboundary collaboration, O&A, or other First Nations to First Nations in Canada, First Nations to our tribal relatives in the US, all those things are happening. We need to think in Canada about mirroring some of the positive components to mitigation processes, and it's nowhere near ready, it's nowhere near perfect in the United States, but they do mitigate for uncontrollable losses. They do have minimum standards in dry water years. We have some as well, but those have to increase. We have to have more than just 0.5 million acre feet flows in Canada for fish. We need more spillage over the dams for the juveniles to get down into the ocean and not get chewed up through the generators, through the turbines. Bigger investments in fish and ecosystem restoration. BC Hydro gets off the hook on this stuff. We have Fish and Wildlife Compensation Program, which pales in comparison to anything that's done in the United States, and something that we should all push very hard to have enhanced in a dramatic way. I think they have a $5 million budget, and the equivalent in the United States for the same similar body of water is about a $200 million process. We have to ensure that First Nations have not only a collective table with everyone, but to respect their title and rights and the Constitution and the laws that have changed, a bilateral relationship and a place in the negotiating table between the United States and Canada, and what joint decision making on the land. We want to be able to have stronger partnerships with resident communities. We want to ensure that revenue sharing is a piece of that. $120 million a year comes back into Canada in terms of a downstream benefit entitlement payment, and that goes directly into BC coffers, into general revenue. It's not tied to anything. It's there to try to balance the budget for other purposes. That has to change. All the Indigenous nations have received $0 from the impacts that have occurred, and those funds are desperately needed to enhance communities and just to start to design the governance processes necessary to move forward.
This is the result of an analysis actually being done with BC Hydro here for the basin, and it shows that in the lower elevation and the lower portions of the basin, we're looking at a minus 40 to 50% snow water equivalent on April the 1st. The other thing that's important to notice is this blue block here. As you get further north in the basin, and particularly in this place, here's Revelstoke, you have an increase in snow. That's because, remember, it said there was going to be an increase in precipitation in the winter. Well, as you're at high elevations and it's cold, you end up with more snow. If you look at the whole basin, this is very helpful because the basin's different. Here's the current climate. The green areas show the portion that's usually where precipitation comes as snow in the winter. The red areas where it comes as rain. If you look going forward to the 2020s with a 1.2 degree change, 1.7 degree change, minus 3.6% snow in BC, minus 21% in the US portion of the basin. And then as we go forward, minus 11% in the 2040s with a 2 degree change, and minus 35% in the southern portion of the nation. This is crucial. We will become the holders in British Columbia of a whole lot of storage and a whole lot of valuable cold water. Very valuable. With the projected changes, unregulated, what we see is higher winter flows because there's more rain. We see an earlier peak flow, you're already seeing it, and we see lower summer flows.
Are there creative options for multinational governance of the Columbia River that gives voice to the common good? What are the options currently for basin-wide governance? And it comes down to, I think, two things really, the Boundary Waters Treaty and the International Joint Commission, and then the Columbia River Treaty, which Jay has spoken about. And why do I start with the Boundary Waters Treaty and the IJC? I start there because 20-some years ago, we asked lawyers, what's the way forward legally to get to salmon restoration? And they looked at a whole bunch of options and really came back and said, the best option is the International Joint Commission, because when Grand Coulee was constructed, they had to get approval to change the water levels at the Canadian border. So they had to go to the IJC, they did that, and the IJC said, you must compensate and indemnify any parties injured in Canada as a result of the raising of the water levels at the border. And our lawyer said, there's the door, walk through it.
So I really emphasize that we've looked to the IJC, looked to the federal government for justice, and it has been denied.
Maybe to get justice, we've got to start in the right place, and that is First Nations leadership. Really only Indigenous nations that had come to the fore and said, we need a transboundary governance mechanism. So that led to 15 U.S. tribes, 4 Canadian nations, working with the university's consortium on this.
In 2015, we lost approximately 250 to 300,000 sockeye just due to water temperatures as they migrated up through the system, and that many fish didn't make the spawning grounds that year. So again, we've got opportunities to look at change and how we manage that system and how we utilize those investments we've made in those areas over the last 20, 30 years. The Columbia River Treaty process gives us the opportunity again to start to look at those habitats and areas in Canada, and we think one of the biggest benefits going forward is going to be getting those fish, those salmon back up over Chief Joe, Coulee into the Canadian waters. Climate change, it solves a lot of problems going forward again for our future generations, and I can't emphasize that enough. That's who we're working for. That's who the tribes look 7 generations out, and everything we do today is to provide those opportunities for those future generations.
And so again, the court is encouraging the Crowns to start looking at what consent means. And that's not a unilateral interpretation of consent, but it's actually sitting down with Indigenous nations and figuring out what consent looks like in practice to them. What can the people of the Columbia Basin learn from salmon continuing to return to the Okanagan River? And I think, the simplest answer that I can give you is that it's possible. We've been able to successfully restore salmon runs to the Okanagan, and there's no reason without collaboration that we can't see the return of salmon to the Upper Columbia. And further bringing back salmon into Okanagan Lake is a scientifically supported approach to reinvigorating those salmon stocks, which are the lifeblood and of critical importance to the Silks Okanagan people. And when we take care of the land and water take care of us. This is our law. That is a direct quote from our Okanagan Nation Water Declaration.
When our political leadership cannot step forward as the leaders that we need to see, sometimes it's the grassroots leadership that we need to see. When we've been asked to step up, I like to think that we do now step up. The United Church of Canada has apologized once for colonialism in general and apologized a second time for its role in the Indian residential schools. And we still have a lot of work to do to live into those apologies.
The reason we were asked to speak was to kind of turn our thoughts to what can happen next. And one of the things that I think is important for all of us to know, at least in BC, we're undergoing quite a lot of curriculum change. The idea was to try and help teachers understand an Aboriginal way of knowing, without it being pan-Aboriginal, but finding things that were in common with ways that First Nations, Métis and Inuit children, which we in BC call Aboriginal, are raised and also taught in many Indigenous cultures. When we're working with children, if we try and just tell them all of the things about the environment that we're worried about, we risk them kind of shutting down and pushing away just from sheer need to kind of survive it. We really need to connect our kids, just get them outside.
People feel more passionately about protecting things they have a personal connection to. Through environmental education and getting people out into nature, you can create and foster that connection and instill a desire to be a responsible environmental citizen and protect the wild and natural places around you. Once you've had the experience of sitting silently in a canoe in the middle of a lake or floating down a river and observing birds, turtles, moose, or whatever comes your way, and knowing that they're observing you as well, you don't just know or understand that these places should be preserved and protected and that they have inherent value. You feel it. You feel it in your bones and you feel it in your soul. And we need more people with that level of dedication. That's what we need to effect a spiritual, social, and ecological transformation of the watershed. Thank you.
Could be saved.